Medieval facts to fall asleep to. Have you ever wondered what life was really like in the Middle Ages? Not the battles, kings, or castles, but the quiet, everyday details no one talks about. Most of what we imagine about medieval times comes from movies or fantasy stories. But behind the armor and royal feasts, there was a slower, more ordinary world, a world built on habits, routines, and surprising innovations that shaped the lives of millions. In this video, we'll explore the lesser-known facts about the Middle Ages, things that are rarely mentioned in history books but reveal just how creative and adaptable people really were. You'll learn how medieval villagers kept their homes warm without electricity, how they preserved food for harsh winters, and why sleep meant something completely different 1,000 years ago. We'll talk about the science, the daily routines, and even the beliefs that influenced how people lived and rested. No fantasy, no drama, just real, fascinating facts about how humans survived, thrived, and built the foundations of the world we live in today. So if you're ready to relax, listen, and maybe even fall asleep while learning something new, let's travel back in time to an era where every sound, every candlelight, and every simple invention had a story to tell. 1. Beclum, how people slept in the Middle Ages. When we think about sleep, most of us imagine a soft mattress, a warm blanket, and the steady hum of modern life in the background. But in the Middle Ages, sleep was an entirely different experience, shaped by the rhythms of nature, the architecture of homes, and the daily demands of survival. People didn't sleep in one continuous stretch as we do today. In fact, historians believe that segmented sleep was common across Europe for hundreds of years. This meant that a typical night was divided into two parts: the first sleep and the second sleep. The first sleep usually began shortly after sunset. With no artificial lighting other than candles or all lamps, nightfall naturally signaled the end of the day. People would go to bed a few hours after dusk, often around 8 or 9 p.m., and sleep for 3 to 4 hours. Then, sometime after midnight, they would wake up, not because of noise or disturbance, but because this was considered normal. The period between the first and second sleep, sometimes called the watch, lasted for 1 to 2 hours. During this quiet time, people prayed, talked with family members, or even visited neighbors. Some used this time for intimacy or reflection, while monks and scholars read religious texts or wrote in the faint glow of candlelight. After the watch ended, people would return to bed for their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This pattern was deeply connected to the slower rhythm of medieval life, one that followed the natural light of the sun and the silence of the night. In an age without clocks or alarm tones, the body's own sense of time dictated when to rest and when to rise. This segmented sleep may even have been healthier in some ways. Modern sleep researchers suggest that the break between sleeps allowed the body to enter different cycles of rest and alertness, aligning with the brain's natural circadian rhythms. The beds themselves were often quite simple, though they varied depending on wealth and status. Nobles and wealthy merchants might have elaborate wooden bed frames with heavy curtains to keep in warmth and privacy. These bedchambers were sometimes shared by several family members, and the curtains also served to trap heat during cold nights. Peasants, on the other hand, slept on straw or wool-filled mattresses placed on wooden boards or even directly on the floor. The bedding was coarse, and while it offered some comfort, it couldn't compare to what we think of as softness today. Blankets were made of wool or fur, and pillows, if they existed, were often stuffed with hay or feathers. Another fascinating detail about medieval sleep is how people shared beds. In poorer households, several family members, or even guests, might sleep together for warmth. Bed sharing wasn't seen as unusual or improper, it was simply practical. Travelers could even rent a spot in someone's bed at inns, a common practice known as bedding with strangers. Hygiene standards were different, and the concept of personal space didn't exist the way it does now. Yet, even in these crowded sleeping conditions, rest was considered sacred, a time of renewal that prepared the body for another day of hard labor. Interestingly, the concept of privacy in sleep only began to evolve in the late medieval and early modern periods. As cities grew and people accumulated more wealth, they began to design homes with dedicated bedrooms. Before that, a single large room served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping area for the entire family. Nighttime wasn't entirely silent, either. The sounds of livestock, creaking wood, whined through thatched roofs, and the crackle of the hearth were constant companions. Sleep, then, wasn't about silence, it was about familiarity. Religious beliefs also played a role in how medieval people understood sleep. Many saw it as a little death, a temporary departure of the soul from the body. Because of this, prayers before bed were essential, a way to protect the spirit through the darkness of night. People believed that dreams could be divine messages, omens, or reflections of moral health. It wasn't uncommon for someone to wake after the first sleep and record a dream in a small notebook or recount it to a priest the next day. In monasteries, the rhythm of sleep was governed by devotion. Monks would rise at specific hours to pray, sometimes multiple times through the night, aligning their rest with sacred ritual rather than comfort. Fireplaces played a crucial role in how well one could rest. In wealthier homes, the fire might be kept burning through the night, providing both warmth and a sense of security. In peasant cottages, the embers would be covered with ashes to preserve heat until morning. Winter nights could be brutally cold, and many families relied on animal skins, thick wool blankets, or even sleeping near livestock to stay warm. It was a life of constant adaptation, finding small, clever ways to survive in a world that offered little luxury. Despite all the hardships, medieval sleep wasn't as uncomfortable or grim as we might imagine. The human body adapts, and in many ways, their rest was more in tune with nature than ours today. There were no glowing screens, no artificial lights disrupting melatonin, and no rush to wake for a 9-to-5 job. Sleep followed the rhythm of life itself, the fading of sunlight, the cooling of air, and the steady awareness that rest was not a luxury but a necessity for survival. By studying medieval sleep habits, historians have discovered a surprising truth. While our technology has advanced, our natural sleep patterns may have become more fragile. The medieval person, with their segmented sleep, candlelight evenings, and slower pace, might have been closer to what our bodies truly need: a balance between wakefulness and rest, night and day, silence and thought. In a sense, to understand how medieval people slept is to remember what it means to rest as humans, not as machines powered by schedules and alarms. 2. Bucklam medieval food preservation. When we open our refrigerators today, we rarely stop to think about how fragile our access to food really is. With just one click, we can store, freeze, or reheat anything. But imagine a world without electricity, without cold storage, and without mass production, a world where every meal depended on the cycle of the seasons and the ingenuity of the people who worked the land. That was the reality of the Middle Ages. In that world, food preservation wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a matter of survival. For most medieval families, food had to last through the long winter months, when crops couldn't grow and fresh produce was scarce. The rhythm of the year was defined by the harvest, and once it ended, the challenge began: how to make the food last. Salt, smoke, air, and sunlight became the invisible tools of preservation. Natural elements turned into life-saving technologies. The ability to preserve food could determine whether a village thrived or faced hunger. One of the most essential preservation methods was salting. Salt was precious, so valuable, in fact, that it was often used as a form of currency. Large quantities of meat, especially pork and fish, were packed into wooden barrels and layered with salt. The salt drew moisture out of the flesh, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't thrive. This process could keep meat edible for months, sometimes even longer. In coastal regions, salted fish, especially herring, became a cornerstone of medieval diets. For people living far from the sea, trade networks ensured that salted or dried fish still reached inland towns and monasteries. Smoking was another widely used method. Meats were hung over smoldering fires in smokehouses or hearths, absorbing compounds that both flavored and protected the food from spoilage. The smoke not only added a rich taste but also kept away insects. In some homes, this process was continuous. The smoky smell that clung to walls, fabrics, and hair was simply part of daily life. The same smoke that darkened the rafters of cottages also ensured that families had something to eat when the snow came. Drying using the heat of the sun or a warm oven was equally vital. Fruits, herbs, and grains could be dried and stored in sacks or jars, lasting for months without decay. Peasants dried apples, plums, beans, and even roots. Herbs were hung in bunches from beams or rafters, their scents mixing with the smoky air. In a world where waste could mean hunger, nothing was discarded lightly. Even small scraps of dried bread could be soaked in broth or ale to create filling meals later. In colder climates, fermentation became a powerful ally. Through careful control of time and temperature, people transformed raw ingredients into foods that lasted far beyond their natural lifespan. Cabbage became sauerkraut, milk became cheese, and grain became ale. These weren't just preservation methods, they were transformations that created entirely new flavors and nutrients. Fermented foods were rich in probiotics long before anyone knew what that meant. Monasteries, which often functioned as centers of learning and agriculture, were especially skilled in fermentation. Their beer, bread, and cheese became renowned, sustaining both body and spirit. Pickling was another clever technique. Vegetables and fruits were stored in brine or vinegar, sealed in ceramic or wooden containers. The acidity prevented the growth of harmful microorganisms. Pickled onions, cucumbers, and even eggs could be found in households that could afford vinegar or salt. Every jar represented foresight, a small victory against the uncertainty of nature. In wealthier estates and castles, preservation methods were more refined. Ice houses and cool cellars were built to store meat and dairy in the colder months. Some estates even had underground rooms designed specifically for long-term storage, insulated by thick walls and covered with straw. Sugar, imported from distant lands, was occasionally used to preserve fruits in syrup, creating early forms of jams and conserves, luxuries reserved for the upper class. However, for most people, food preservation was deeply communal. Villages often came together to prepare for winter, slaughtering pigs, drying grains, and salting fish as a group. These events were part of the rhythm of medieval life, blending practicality with tradition. Children learned the art of smoking meat or drying herbs at a young age, not through books but by watching their elders work. It was a knowledge passed down through touch, sight, and smell. Without modern hygiene or packaging, food spoilage was still a constant threat. People relied on their senses: smell, color, and texture to judge whether something was safe to eat. Spices, imported from the East, helped mask the flavor of meat that had begun to turn. Though expensive, pepper, cinnamon, and cloves became symbols of wealth and sophistication. For ordinary folk, herbs like thyme, sage, and garlic played a similar role, adding both flavor and protection against bacteria. What's remarkable is how effective these simple methods were. Archaeological studies have found that salted, smoked, or dried medieval foods could remain edible for astonishing lengths of time. While their flavors were strong and sometimes harsh, these preservation methods kept communities alive through harsh winters and unpredictable harvests. In essence, food preservation in the Middle Ages was both a science and an art, a delicate balance between knowledge, environment, and necessity. Today, we rarely think about where our food comes from or how long it lasts. But the medieval approach reminds us of a world where every meal was hard-earned, and every preserved piece of food carried the memory of work, care, and survival. It's a lesson not just in history, but in resilience, how humanity learned to adapt to nature, turning its limits into opportunities. The next time we open our fridge, it's worth remembering that for our ancestors, every bite of food in winter was the result of foresight, tradition, and skill.